World War II was a global war that began in 1939 and ended in 1945. Despite the fact that the war only lasted 6 years, it is known as one of the deadliest wars in history, resulting in approximately 70 million casualties. One man who contributed in the war was a man named Aubrey Fletcher. Now 91 years old, Mr. Fletcher shared his experiences from fighting for the British during the war when he was only 17 years old. Living in London, Mr. Fletcher did what he describes as the patriotic thing to do by volunteering for the war just in his late teens. I came into this interview with little knowledge about what World War II really stood for, but as I heard the story of Aubrey Fletcher's life unravel, I came out understanding that to many of the men fighting in this war, they were fighting for bigger reasons than just to win. It meant showing your patriotism and your love.
I pretty much made up my mind that this is what I wanted to do. And so they went along with me. It was a patriotic thing to do for your country, and most people supported the idea in England of going to war.
World War II was fought between two groups of nations. One of these groups was known as the Allies and the other the Axis. The Allies consisted of Russia, America, and Britain. The Allies were part of an anti-German coalition, as opposed to the Axis, which consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. This war is said to have started with the initial invasion of Poland by Germany. From this event, the war soon spiraled out of control and eventually became known as the deadliest war in history. Mr. Aubrey Fletcher was born in 1922 and raised in London, England. He had an overall normal childhood, living with his mother and father until the war began in 1939. At age 17, he made the life-changing decision to join the war. He spent 6 years in the Army, eventually working his way up to be a captain.
And I went from private to corporal, then corporal to sergeant, sergeant to staff sergeant. Staff sergeant, what was called a warrant officer. That was a pretty high rank before you became what we call a commissioned officer.
When asked about any stories Mr. Fletcher had from this war, his first memory was from the bombings on London, which occurred in September 1940 and went all the way to May 1941. These attacks are known as the Blitz attacks and were inflicted by the Germans as a strategic way of taking over London. However, the main goal of demoralizing the British was not achieved within these attacks. In fact, even after these attacks, Britain was still able to strive in the growing economy.
The Germans were bombing us with their planes, and quite often machine gunning too. They dived down the road we were driving on with the airplane machine gunning you. And the civilians in France too, being killed. It's tough to describe when you're being bombed and explosives are dropping all over around you. You just hope like heck they ain't gonna drop on you.
As did many young men at this time, Mr. Fletcher stepped up to volunteer at the beginning of Britain's involvement. He spent much time training and was eventually sent out into the field as a private. One incident from the field that Mr. Fletcher recalls is how a bullet grazed his head, taking out a large chunk of flesh. He was then sent to the hospital to recover, but rather than sitting around and waiting for a full recovery, he decided to just get up and leave the hospital.
And then they just wrapped a great big bandage around my head like this, because no one would do these days. But it was all they could do in those days. And then they left me for a while on a stretcher in the floor of the hospital with a lot of other guys in the same boat. So it wasn't one of the urgent ones. I just decided I'd get the heck out of there. So I just got up and I walked out of the hospital.
This was the case for many men at the time of the war. There was such a small nurse-to-patient ratio that it was nearly impossible for each injured veteran to get the attention that they really needed and deserved. This kind of get-up-and-go mentality was a moral which many people held during the war. Everyone was very intent on pushing through whatever kind of personal pain and problems they had at the time in order to defend their nation. Among the nations fighting together, there is a sense of mutual respect because of the idea that they are all fighting for a common cause. Mr. Fletcher explains how although it took a while, he eventually began to become accustomed to his allies. He and many of the other members of the war learned that they were not only fighting for a common cause, but against a common enemy. Even after the war, and to this day, many people have a hard time forgiving and forgetting about what went on many years ago.
That seems to be something that's contagious to all armies, and perhaps is natural. They think that they are better than the other guy's army. Mm-hmm. And in World War II, all through, the Americans thought that they were better than the French and the English armies and vice versa.
The idea that these feelings are still there shows how important the war was to him and many of the other men and women that were involved. This was not a war only based off of nation conflicts. This is a war that tested nationalism and how faithful and devoted you were to your country. This was a concept made clear to Fletcher and even shaped him to be the war hero that he is today.
Gravity is working against me.